Welcome to Pace TV and another show in the Hobnobbing series. Today we're going to explore the ancient art of glassmaking. It is generally accepted today that the origin of glass lies far back in the prehistory of the Eastern Mediterranean countries, most probably Egypt. The earliest glass vessels certainly owe their origin to that country, probably in the 15th century BC. Before that period, about 5000 BC, beads of stone were glazed by the Egyptians. The earliest glass vessels that can, with some certainty, be dated are 3 vases with the cartouche of King Thutmose III, who lived between 1501 and 1449 BC. One of these vases is in the British Museum, a second in the Munich Antiquarium, and a third in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. All 3 are of turquoise blue glass. Tucked away inside a San Diego winery is a wonderful glassmaker named James Stone, who gives new meaning to the term beauty. James, few people know the process of glassmaking. Can you take us through the steps?
I can. First, I'd like to say that a few people know that glassmaking originated over 5,000 years ago. They found archaeological evidence of glassmaking, the furnaces and the tanks where they made glass in the city of Ur, which most people know as the city of Babylon.
Oh.
So the origins of glassmaking are ancient. It's the second oldest man-made process known to man. I discovered this wonderful history of glass that I'm now doing more and more research on, because I'm just very curious how one process could last for 5,000 years.
Yeah.
The same process, the same way. People are amazed when I really, this is the honest truth, if you look at the tools we use today, those tools are very similar to the tools they used 3,000 years ago. And what's very interesting is glassmaking today has not appreciably changed from glassmaking 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, the glass was made of sand and potash and calcium, and it was made on the shores of the Mediterranean, where they had the sand from the Mediterranean Sea and the calcium from the shells and potash from a very specific swamp plant that they harvested and burned and turned to ash. And very interestingly enough, 5,000 years ago, they were able to make glass at about 900 degrees. Today, the chemical formula has changed a little bit. We do it the same way. We start with sand, and we mix it with potash and calcium. And today, a few other minor minerals that we use to make it flux easier and flow easier, and give it a little more working time. But it's basically the same recipe. And we now cook glass at about 2150 degrees. So it's about twice the temperature. And of course the quality of the glass has greatly improved. In those days they didn't have, 5,000 years ago, they didn't have sifters, and they didn't have ways to pull out the impurities. They had no way to test to make sure that the potash, the consistency of the potash was the same, the consistency of the calcium was the same. They ground up shells, but they didn't know that some shells have more calcium in them than others. But today it's a lot more pure.
Tell us about some of the tools that's used, the metal tools.
Well, let's start with the wood tools, because long before metal tools, there were wood tools. And glass has developed in about 3 or 4 historiographical and history periods. Prior to the Copper Age, there were no metal tools. They made glass entirely with wood tools and sand, and it was cast, and it was a kiln, it was a sand formed. When the Copper Age came around, and they used wood. They actually made tools with wood, and if you keep the wood wet, it doesn't burn all the way. It burns part way. You get a carbon layer, and the carbon layer actually protects the wood, and it also won't stick to the glass. Carbon won't stick to glass. So they used wooden tools for shaping, and they had no blowpipes. They dripped the glass onto a core of sand. It was called core forming. Well, the Copper Age came along, and they started to have a few tools that they could poke and shape with, and copper rods to put their sand cores on. And of course, the next big step in the evolution of the technology was the Bronze Age, when they actually developed a blowpipe, because they were able to make bronze, and then they could dip that into the glass and actually blow glass. So it was the dawn of the Bronze Age that actually saw the development of glass blowing as we know it today.
Tell
Okay.
us about this tool.
This is a pair of jacks. This is the most important tool, single most important tool in glass blowing, because it's used, it's like a multi-function tool. It's used for shaping the glass. You can use the backside for cooling, spot cooling the glass, and most importantly, you use this to make a little mark on the glass for when you transfer the glass from the blowpipe to the punty, so you can finish the opening end. And this particular pair of jacks is made in Italy by a family that's been blowing glass for 1,000 years. So
So it has multifunctions.
multifunctions, and it's just a wonderful tool. It feels nice in your hand, and it when your glass is nice and hot, it just kind of becomes one with the glass because of the way it's curved and shaped. And it's hard to tell until you use it, but this edge has a certain shape to it, and the type of steel. Nobody really knows what the formulation of this steel is because it's a family secret.
No.
And glassmaking for all of history is full of secrets, family secrets. The next most important tool is a pair of tweezers. And again, just like what you use to pick your eyebrows, these ones go back thousands of years. This is exactly what they looked like 1,000 years ago. So it's just it's an ancient art that there's been no really big new developments. There have been some technology developments. We have better furnaces and ovens. We're much more efficient with the use of our fuel. But like the hand tools are exactly the same. I have a pair of, these are what's known as diamond shears. They can make a kind of a diamond shape here. And a lot of times you use these if you have a big lump of glass that you need to cut. You reach in and you cut it. And use these diamond shears, and on the end it's got something to hold your blowpipe when you have to move your blowpipe, the hot end, or you can pick. It's got a little tiny bit, you can pick little tiny things out of things and put little tiny things on.
So these are all made out of what kind of materials?
These are all made out of steel, and the ones that come from Italy are a formula of steel that is only found in Italian glassblowing families.
This looks like a spatula.
It is, and this is a wonderful tool. It's one of my favorite tools. This is like a spatula. It's a piece of steel. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. It's got kind of a knife edge. It's not sharp. It won't cut you, but it has a kind of a crisp edge. And you use this when you get a large lump of glass on, and it's running away from you, and you have to get it under control, and you actually just slap the glass, just like you're slapping a baby's bottom. And you slap it into shape. You make it behave itself. Or you can use it softly, if you want to shape and smooth.
Let's talk about the type of kilns that you use.
Okay, there's kilns and there's ovens and glory holes. There's 3 major heating devices. The first one is actually a big box that we call the tank or the furnace, and it's a place where you actually make the glass. It can be either powered by natural gas, by propane, or now some of the new technology is they are powering them by electricity, and the electric ones are much more efficient because there's no chimney. If you're burning something, you have to have a chimney to let the carbon dioxide out. If it's electric, it just radiates heat.
What about microwave?
You know, I've heard about microwave for melting glass, but I've never seen any glass artists do that. I think that happens in industry, but I don't think it's made it to the studio level yet.
Right. And so now you have 3 different types of
Well, you have
furnaces.
You have the furnace where you make the glass, and that's where you get the molten pool of glass that we dip into
Right.
with the pipe. Then you have the glory hole, which is essentially a big drum, like a 50-gallon drum. And the glory hole has a burner, and it does not have a chimney, and it pools up the heat, and it allows you to flash reheat whatever you're working on to make it soft and malleable.
So you only put your piece in for about, what, 10, 15 seconds? On that
Everyone's a little different. In my own head, I count in my head when I put the piece in to flash reheat it. If I just want to keep it hot enough so it doesn't break, I count to 1003, 1001, 1002, 1003. If I need to get it a little bit hotter because it's been out too long, I go to 5. If I want to get it soft, just a little bit soft, so that I can let gravity do work for me, or just want to look at it, I go to 10. If I want it really soft so it's moving, I'll go to a 20 count. And in my head, it's just like counting out in a song, and the beat of a song, I count out the numbers by 1,000.
I see.
So, and sometimes I can actually be talking to you and in my head counting out 1,000, 1,000.
Like a beat.
Yeah, like a beat,
Right.
like a backbeat.
Now you start out with your material. What do you call that? The material that you use for the glass?
In my studio, and every studio could be different. In my studio, it's batch.
A batch?
B-A-T-C-H, batch. And that I buy my sand and my calcium and my potash all pre-mixed, because the chances of making a mistake are too great when you're mixing it yourself. If you buy it pre-mixed, it's almost guaranteed to be perfect. And
So now you take that batch,
yep.
and what do you
we
do with it?
Shovel it into the furnace, 25 pounds at a time. We wait for that 25 pounds to reach about 2,100, 2,200 degrees, and it actually has to boil, just like making a sauce. And you actually have to look at the bubbles. And as it's cooking, the size of the bubbles change. They go from very large to, as it gets closer and closer to being done, the bubbles get smaller and smaller. And you know it's finished when there are no more bubbles.
I see. So you have to keep looking in there.
And then 3 or 4 hours later, you got to shovel another 25 pounds in. And you do that until it's full. So on days when we make glass, I'm actually here 24 hours.
So now here we are. We're going to see a plate being made by a very much acclaimed expert in this field, right?
He's expert is probably not exactly the term, but he's a very experienced artist who has worked for a lot of very famous people and has a particular skill in this style of plate making called encalmo. And an encalmo plate or vase is one where you have separate colors that are blown in separate bubbles and opened up and assembled together hot. And what happens is you have a very distinct line between the colors, with just a little bit of clear separating them. So it's a very dramatic look. And that's a very hard skill to have, because you actually have 4 people working in a very small confined space. You have 2 different bubbles going on at once. The guy who's holding the largest pipe has to keep that bubble and that pipe hot enough so it doesn't crack, but not too hot so it doesn't lose its shape. And you keep adding onto it, and it gets heavier and heavier, and somebody has to come in and help him out and take that responsibility for a time. So it's a long, tedious process.
So you go in from one furnace to another also, right?
Well, we start with pre-mixed color. And that color, the color we use is either made in Germany, Australia, or here in America. And it's formulated so that chemically it works with our glass. And we have to bring that up to 900 degrees before we even start. Slowly. If we bring it up too quickly, it explodes. So we start with a big bar of color that we melt, and then we put that over a clear bubble. And then we have to encase that in clear glass, and that's all happening in the glory hole for flash melting, and in the tank where we gather more clear glass. And then when we're all done making the piece, we put it into another device called a leer, and the leer allows us to hold it at 900 degrees until all the temperatures and internal stresses equalize. And then once they are equalized, we slowly bring it down to room temperature at about 25 degrees an hour until it reaches ambient temperature, so that the stresses have a chance to slowly release out of the glass.
When you take it out of the small furnace, and just to get it malleable, you put it on a table and roll it. What is that table called?
The Marver plate.
The Marver plate.
The Marver plate, from the French term for marble. When glass blowing, when it went from glass making to glass blowing, they found that they could use a flat piece of highly polished marble to chill the glass and help control it, so that you can force the heat to be where you want it to be in the glass. And so up until probably 200 years ago, the Marver plates were all marble, highly polished, very well taken care of and maintained, because you don't want any pits or scratches in them. They're the anchor tool for glass making in the shop.
But yours isn't marble.
No, you know, now people use cast iron is a very popular surface. I have a piece of steel, and my steel has been tempered and hardened from just use. And we clean it every day. We don't use any surface conditioners on it. It's pure steel. The only thing that happens is the hot glass actually makes it smooth. If you go up and touch it, it's very satiny and soft to the touch.
I noticed that the worker uses something to roll the piece.
Pad.
A pad? What is it made out of?
One of the things that happens is in glass making, almost everything is done in a very intimate fashion with the glass. The glass blower or the glass maker or the gaffer, the lead gaffer, is in very close physical contact with the glass. In our shop, we use, and all shops are different. In our shop, we use black and white only newspaper. Can't have any color in it. We use about 6 or 8 sheets. It's folded into a little pad and is soaked in water so it's wet. And you can actually take that newspaper and put it on your bare hand, and it acts as a pad, a protector, so the heat doesn't go through. What happens is the glass hits the water instantly turns to steam, but blows off between the glass and the newspaper and takes the heat off in the form of steam. So you actually can touch hot glass that's molten and squeeze it and form it with this newspaper between your hands.
Doesn't it, the print come off of the paper?
No, because the paper, well, first of all, the black and white print versus color print, and there's a big delineation between them. Black and white print is more or less a carbon-based print, has no chemicals in it, and when the temperature from the glass hits it, it just instantly turns to carbon, which, as you remember, carbon doesn't stick to glass. It's slippery.
Ah, I see.
And so it just becomes part of the carbon process. But now color print, on the other hand, that's another story. Color print contains lots of additives and chemicals, in particular selenium. If you use color print, when the color print hits the hot glass, it immediately vaporizes and the selenium comes out into the air, and if you breathe it, you die. Oh, wow. Just one of the many dangerous aspects of glass blowing. I recently heard somebody refer to glass blowing as the extreme sports of the art world.
That's true.
Because everything about it is extreme. In the glass making field, even if you're working with tiny little small making beads on a torch, there are all kinds of dangers. Dangers of fire, dangers of burn, dangers of explosions, dangers of poisoning. It's very common for glass makers who don't take protective care of themselves to have kidney failure and adrenal gland failure and cataracts. So we're always very aware of, you got to wear your protective glasses that filter out the ultraviolet and infrared rays. When you're around particulate matter that becomes airborne, you have to wear a dust mask or a filter.
Do you breathe it in?
You can. The silicosis is a very common disease that affected glass factory workers before they knew that that particulate matter caused it.
So you have to wear a mask
when you're dealing
sometime.
with dust.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And when we put color on, there's 3 different types of color. There's bar color, which is big solid bar, and there's frit, which is bar that's been ground up into various granular sizes, and there's powder, which is bar color that's been ground so fine it's powder. We don't use powder in our shop because you have to have a very special exhaust fan and hood, like in a restaurant, because that powder becomes airborne very easily, and if you don't exhaust it through a filter, it ends up in the air.
It reminds me of plastic. They either use it in pellets or sheets or ground up powder. I'm sure
never
they're
in a chemical form. You know,
right.
the crack-off box is kind of an interesting place, and it's not the crack-off box that's interesting, it's the crack-off that's interesting. The crack-off is a move that we have that when we're transferring a piece of glass from one pipe to a punty, from punty to punty, or when we're finished and we have to take it off the punty and put it away. And the crack-off is one of those areas that's very dangerous. You can spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. There's actually an artist I know who, when he was making glass, he no longer makes glass, would work on a piece for 24 hours. He had a bunch of assistants, and they'd work on a piece, and at one point he would go and take a break and have dinner and take a nap and come back 4 or 5 hours later and they're still working on it. And you invest a lot of time into it, and you invest a lot of your emotion into the piece and your personality. And at the crack off, it's critical you get it right, because the crack off, if it goes wrong, the piece is gone. Sometimes you'll get a crack that runs through the whole piece. Sometimes the crack off is so jarring it knocks the piece off the pipe.
So it's the process of taking the piece off of the pipe is the
Right.
crack, and you do it with what kind of an instrument?
Everyone is a little different. I personally use a file that I dip in water, and I file the little jack line that we use the jacks on. Christopher, who's my lead gaffer and runs my pipe for me, he uses the tweezers, and the tweezers have a little dish in them, and he can get a little water in the tweezers, and he puts a little spot of water right where he wants to crack it off. There are people who just blow on it, get it so cold, they know exactly how cold it needs to be just before it's going to break, and then they just tap the pipe and it comes off. We work as a team. In our shop, the size and caliber of the pieces we make, one person can't blow them themselves. In fact, I have a lot of private students, and my private students, I encourage them to bring their friends to learn to blow with them, because you have to have an assistant to do the crack off, for instance, reheat sometimes. If you're going to put a little lip wrap on, if you're going to add additional color, if you're doing bit work, which is my favorite style of working, where you have a piece on the pipe and you blow it the way you want it, and then somebody brings you hot bits that you cut on and shape on and turn into things like dragons or seahorses or fish or frogs.
This is beautiful, James. Is this your example of bit work?
Well, this is an example of the type of work that we do here, and it includes bit work. This is actually a very unusual piece, and it's a composite of about 3 or 4 different techniques. As I told you, I'm very interested in the ancient techniques, and here we combine hot glass with copper. And copper was the first of the industrial ages, the age of copper, the bronze, and the iron age. And copper and glass share a lot of commonalities, so I feel very close to it. The bit work we were talking about can be seen as best example in these fish. And the fish is basically a blown bottle. And once you blow the bottle and use some wet newspaper and you flatten it out into the fish shape, an assistant will bring you over little bits of glass that have already been colored, and they're hot. Hot glass sticks to hot glass instantly, and you stick it on and cut off just as much glass as you need, the bit. And then using various tools, you can get various shapes. For instance, the fins, I made my own tool so that my fins are unique. There are lots of people who blow fish, but there's nobody who has fish with fins like mine, because I'm the only one with the tool. My eye tool, I made a special tool that I use to press the eyes on. So I cut the little bit, and I take my tool and I press it into the hot bit while it's still soft, and it gives a very unique eye. And then what really makes these pieces unique is that we combine the bit work and the fish, the blown pieces. Here's a blown bowl, and then over here you can see, if you look carefully, there are some pieces that have been fused, sandblasted, and then reheated and slumped into place.
These pieces right
Yes,
here?
these are fan coral.
I see.
And then, of course, the traditional offhand pieces, which are all these leaves, which are solid. So we combine all the pieces. We make the copper bowls ourselves. We start with a big flat sheet of copper, and we actually go out and back, and we have a stump out and back, a big tree stump, and a 2x4 and a hammer, and these are hammered into shape using nothing more than a tree stump and a 2x4.
And you've added water, and you have now a beautiful water fish bowl, or whatever you call it.
Well, we call them fish fountains.
Fish fountain?
And they can be used inside or outside. They work both places. They have a wonderful sound, and of course, if you're a follower of feng shui, you want water, you want the sound, you want the fish facing one another. So
It's just beautiful.
I like to do that kind of work. Well, you have to have an assistant. To do the large pieces, like the Encolmo piece we're going to do, you actually need a number of assistants, and it's like a choreographed dance. We use 4 assistants for the large pieces. Christopher's the lead gaffer, and he's responsible for the safety of the piece, for the blowing of the piece, for the shaping of the piece. He has his gaffer's assistant, which is Luke. He's a large guy. He's very big. We have him because he's physically very strong. He can handle anything. And he does reheats for Christopher. Actually picks the piece up and carries it to the glory hole and does the reheats and carries it back. And he backs Christopher up as a second. If Christopher gets tired and Christopher needs somebody to turn it, he'll turn the piece for him. Then there's a floor assistant, which is Brian, and Brian does some shielding with the wooden paddles to make sure nobody gets burned. He opens and closes the doors. When we need somebody to blow on the end of the pipe while we're shaping it and rolling it at the same time, he'll do that.
Why does he do that?
Well, because it's much more efficient if you have somebody to blow while you roll and shape.
Is it cool off something inside?
No, it actually blows the piece out,
Oh,
makes
it's
it
actually-
larger. He's
oh, I
actually
see.
blowing it out.
I thought he was cooling it.
Not at all. If we didn't have Brian to blow, then Christopher would have to shape it a little bit. Then he'd have to kind of get to the end of the pipe and blow a little bit.
Oh, I see.
Then he'd have to move it back, and by that time it's cold. So then he's got to go reheat it, bring it back and shape it a little bit, then blow it a little bit. But with Brian, if Brian's blowing while Christopher's shaping, and blows it right into that piece of newspaper, and Christopher can get the exact shape that we're at. My role in the team is I'm like the conductor. I design the pieces, I pick the colors, I discuss with Christopher and the team how we're going to make it, and then some would call it micromanage, but I actually think I'm responsible for the fine details of getting the piece made, and I direct the team on the floor. I also can do any of the jobs that are there that all of my assistants do and my gaffer does, but when you're working as a team, you have to have one leader to lead the team in concert to make a beautiful song.
Right, and you do it so well. The art of glassmaking, another interesting hobby for you to consider on Hobnobbing.